All right. Our first session today is about nutrient sovereignty. If you were at was that really last year? Last year's summit?
I think
It
so.
was. It
Dr.
was
Sarah,
last year.
it was last year. Oh my goodness.
Yep,
I think it's a whirlwind.
Time was a
it is.
whirlwind.
I wasn't.
As
I
I was
wasn't
saying
Dr.
last year,
Sarah
no, it
Nahar
must
yet.
have been
I was
wild.
just Sarah Nahar.
Just wild, just wild. So we have a presentation from Dr. Sarah Nahar and Dr. Krisztina Mosdossy. Dr. Sarah Nahar, who, as I was saying a moment ago, was our keynote speaker at last year's summit. So if you were here for that, you will recognize her. Dr. Sarah Nahar is a nonviolent action trainer and interspiritual theologian, an emerging expert of excreta infrastructure technologies. Her doctoral work centers on ecological regeneration, community cultivation, and discard studies. She will teach at the University of Michigan's program in the environment beginning January 2026. Welcome, Sarah. And Dr. Krisztina Mosdossy is a soil ecologist and circular bionutrient economist. She focuses her research on how fungi, nematodes, microarthropods, and other soil organisms cycle carbon and nutrients in agronomic settings. Dr. Mosdossy will be teaching regenerative agriculture at Evergreen State College beginning January 2026. Excited to hear.
And Sarah, I have your video queued up, but if there's anything you want to say beforehand, yeah, feel free.
Thank you so much. It is always good to be with y'all. Krisztina is signing in now. Both of us are currently traveling. Krisztina in India, myself in Jerusalem and in Palestine. And so these are places where our research continues to look at the questions of defecatory and excretory justice and injustice. So we made this recorded presentation for you, and then we'll be here for some Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Sarah.
Be with you to talk today about toward nutrient sovereignty. Thank you. Okay. Greetings. We are Sarah Nahar and Krisztina Mosdossy, and we are really excited to be with you to talk today about toward nutrient sovereignty. First and foremost, we want to start with our acknowledgments. Both of us did this research and lived and studied on Haudenosaunee land, and we are coming to you through these machines, computers, phones, tablets, everything. And so we want to recognize also the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so in the sense that these minerals are extracted from there that are permitting us to connect. So we hope that in honor of the lands that we've studied on and the lands that we're connected to, and wherever you are right now, that everything we do today will be in honor of the past, present, and future elders of Indigenous peoples there, and towards a real equitable way of living on this planet together. We also want to acknowledge that we wrote a lot of the work that's coming into this nascent work together during a time of war and immigration injustice and COVID. And so there's just a lot of upheaval. So we just want to acknowledge that as well. And we hope that our work with the nutrients of our bodies towards the sovereignty of all beings and our collective flourishing is here. And you saw some of the co-authors listed there on the first slide. That's been the lab that Kristina's been working with, and here's a picture of my advisors as we both did our doctoral work and postdocs. And last but not least is the image of my child, and think of the future ones that are coming after. So nutrient sovereignty, what is it? Like, it's a nascent concept which connects issues of justice in a variety of realms, specifically the quest for Indigenous sovereignty, food justice, environmental health, and the ecological imperative of excretory nutrient reclamation. If the nutrients required for food are not sovereign, if they're captured or commodified, then food sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, and the health of the environment are hampered. So building on an agroeconomic and ethnographic story that we're going to be sharing with you, we want to introduce what we've learned so far about nutrient sovereignty and the possibilities of it in central New York on Haudenosaunee land. So we're going to glimpse how nutrient broader equation. So when we have conversations about and when we experiment with local nutrient cycling in culturally relevant, reciprocal, and safe ways, what we're seeing so far, and we're really interested in what you all are also seeing, is that holistic liberatory outcomes for land, water, and people emerge. Okay, that looks like the video is frozen. Talking about this
here we go.
process of
Let's see what happens.
releasing nutrients and seeing what's happening with regards to its collection, processing, and then integration or disposal.
All right, hey folks, sorry, it looks like the video is frozen. We're not quite sure why. Give us one moment.
Happening with regards to its collection, about this process of releasing nutrients and seeing what's happening with regards to its collection, processing, and then integration or disposal. Most of all, what we're seeing is that nutrient sovereignty is an opportunity to engage in reciprocity with the place in which one excretes. A lot of folks here in this audience really have a sense of the importance of this. And this is also an invitation to see yourself and your work as a gift.
Okay, so thank you so much for that so far, Sarah. I would like to show some gratitude for a large group of people that without whom I'm going to be sharing my work with you today, and without this group of people, I wouldn't have been able to do any of this work. So I'd like to say gratitude to the Nelson Lab, in particular Jesse Hernandez and Leah Esipov, who worked very closely on the work that I'm about to show you. They were involved in the data analysis, data collection, etc. And Rebecca Nelson is the professor that runs that lab. So huge amount of gratitude to Rebecca. The Dillman Hill Student Organic Farm is a wonderful farm on Cornell campus run by students. So these are the list of student managers from last year because I'm presenting data from last year. And then I also sent out a lot of samples to Dairy One and Penn State for some of the data that I'm going to be showing today. So thank you to them. And I use icons throughout my presentation that are not necessarily icons that I created. And here's a list of artists that I'm very grateful do that for a living. So I'd like to start by saying that I think this audience is very familiar with why we collect urine and the benefits of that process, and that although we're in a contemporary context and there's a lot of barriers to adopting pee cycling in this contemporary context, these are not new ways of being. And nutrients have been used in agriculture since time immemorial. For example, Aztecs in Mexico were living in a zero waste society. China, Korea, Japan are well known for using night soil, for example. So this is a slide showing in the early 1900s a commercial market on the water. So these are boats. It's not a high quality photo, but to give you a sense of what's in this photo, these are small boats that are filled with excreta. The excreta was seen as a very valuable resource and exchanged for money and used as a fertilizer on agricultural land. So these are, like I said, not new concepts, and we're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants when we're doing this work. However, in our contemporary context, we're living in a world where food insecurity is disproportionate to those who are American Indian or Alaska Natives, as shown in this particular figure, compared to the average US household. And in order to address this food insecurity, and especially that's disproportionate to these populations, nutrients that are essential to growing food are required to be more accessible for people, since right now, as many people in this audience know, we rely on synthetic fertilizer that's very expensive and is only increasing in prices, and so become less and less accessible, therefore increasing food insecurity in certain populations. And that brings me to my specific research with Jessie Hernandez, who I met in 2023 while shucking corn as part of lab work, harvesting corn in the field. And I was curious about his motivation to be in the field of agriculture. And he told me a story about his high school in his hometown, LA, and how he and a group of students were interested in growing culturally relevant foods. And they raised about $20,000 to build a greenhouse at their high school in order to grow culturally relevant foods. So this inspired in me to push a little bit further in the agricultural work that we were doing already at Cornell that focused mainly on Eurocentric crops. And I thought, well, if we're growing crops anyways in our agricultural experiments, why not grow crops that are meaningful to the students that we're working with, such as Jessie? And so that's when we started working with the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program, which I will refer to moving forward as AISP, AIISP, which is at Cornell. Jessie works with them very closely to see what culturally relevant crops would be of interest to Haudenosaunee nations in these agricultural experiments. And we found that the skunk bean, is called skunk because it's depicted here, is black and white, is a very important culturally relevant crop to the Haudenosaunee. And so we started growing those. And then also ceremonial tobacco is very important. Well, maybe not a food, but still important culturally. So we started growing these two crops in our experiments. And our experiments were centered around urine as one circular fertilizer, but also other circular fertilizers like fish effluent, which is the byproduct of an aquaculture system. And there's an aquaculture lab on Cornell campus. And they were experiencing something similar to us where in distress that they're flushing all these valuable nutrients down the drain and having nowhere to put them. So we thought we'd see if we could use them as a nutrient source in growing crops. And we also have some partners in Honduras and Kenya that work with black soldier flies. So black soldier flies, they're often grown for their larvae that are used as livestock feed, but also their frass or their poop is very good nutrient fertilizer. So we used all of these circular fertilizers in our experiments growing the Haudenosaunee skunk beans and ceremonial tobacco. And what we found was looking at bean weight on the y-axis and all of the nutrients on the x-axis, and WV stands for wood vinegar, which is a byproduct of pyrolysis, or the process of making biochar. And we found that there was no statistically significant difference across all of these fertilizer types, meaning that things like circular fertilizers, urine, fish effluent, and frass, are comparable to synthetic nitrogen, suggesting we don't need the synthetic nitrogen in order to grow these crops. We also found, so here on the y-axis, we have percent total nitrogen in the tissue of the skunk beans. And we found that urine and synthetic fertilizer were performing similarly, providing more nitrogen or more protein in the beans themselves compared to fish effluent and frass, suggesting that it depends on what kind of circular fertilizer you're using, and one is going to be more nutritionally beneficial than the other. We also found that urine and synthetic fertilizer performed similarly in terms of the amount of dry leaf, tobacco dry leaf that was harvested compared to fish effluent and frass. And overall larger leaves as well were found with urine and synthetic fertilizer. So again, suggesting we don't need synthetic fertilizer, we can just rely on urine, but fish effluent and frass didn't really cut it. So another part of this relationship with ASP that Jesse in particular has, is not only we wanted to invite ASP into the project, not just as informants of, okay, what crops are you interested in, but also let's get involved in the harvesting process. So we had one member of ASP, Hyanunya, who's going to come up in the next slide, lead a ceremonial tobacco harvesting process. And this was very beautiful and allowed people to understand more on what kind of research we were doing and that it really works. So they saw, like, for themselves with their own eyes, with their own hands, that using urine as a fertilizer can produce more tobacco leaves. And in addition to leading this ceremonial tobacco harvesting ceremony, Hyanunya, depicted here, is seen as being very happy because he received skunk bean seeds in return. So we were provided with seeds. We bought the seeds from True Love Seeds. And if you're not familiar with seed growing or seed saving, typically you get an incredible abundance in return after growing the plant. And so we were able to return these seeds in abundance to Haudenosaunee communities through the ASP program, and Hyanunya was kind of the liaison in this project, and he's very happy. So this is leading us to this equation that we are working with right now around the idea of nutrient sovereignty. So using urine, nutrients from our own bodies to grow the food, creating seed sovereignty, producing seed so that future years and future generations can also grow food without relying on commercial seed companies. And then these other concepts, body sovereignty. So you need body sovereignty in order to achieve nutrient sovereignty. If you don't have sovereignty over your own body, for example, those who are incarcerated, then you can't have nutrient sovereignty. And so there's a part of the equation that doesn't lead to food sovereignty. Similarly, you need land, healthy soil, clean water sovereignty. So without access to land and access to clean water, similarly, you cannot have food sovereignty. So you need all of these things and probably more that we're not putting into this equation just yet because these are still nascent concepts. But you need all of these things to achieve food sovereignty, and nutrient sovereignty is a big part of that. And you need all of these things in general, for environmental health more broadly. So not necessarily just to grow food, but also to have the opportunity to intentionally manage nutrients from your own body.
And so thinking of this, that equation there, right? One thing that has sometimes happened is that in the discourses around sovereignty, nutrients have been invisibilized. And yes, there's directly urine for agriculture, and that brings a lot of mineral benefits. And so to bring in the aspect of fecal excreta, there's also carbon support that is coming from that angle. And given feces pathogenic potential loads, there are really important ways of processing that. But to leave it out, or especially to flush it in fresh water or send it quote unquote away, is having significant downstream impacts, as well as costing huge amounts of money to process, when there's a possibility that when combined with some of these other important agroecological imperatives and environmental necessities at this time of climate crisis, that these elements in excreta and menstrual blood too, have something to add to this conversation about sovereignty and environmental health, which includes how we feel about our bodies while we're excreting. So that leads into the project that I did at the Salt City Harvest Farm, just up the road from Cornell in Syracuse, then on Onondaga land. So this project relates to assisting folks in thinking collectively and together about what kind of excreta infrastructure system that they wanted. So Salt City Harvest Farm is focusing on growing food, culture, and community through cross-cultural exchange of food traditions with access to farmland, education, and economic opportunities. It specifically focuses on refugee populations. So these would be folks who are not indigenous to the United States, yet are displaced people, potentially displaced indigenous people from elsewhere. So they, like everyone, have environmental health concerns and seek to connect to land. Through this project, the conversation was about what toilet or excreta infrastructure technology interface made the most sense culturally. So we're looking at a question of cultural relevance, as well as thinking through, as farmers who are used to working with manures and other things like that, what they might want to do with their own nutrients. And just the idea that they could have a decision about those nutrients, like not necessarily sending them through freshwater flush systems, but could operate through composting systems or some type of nutrient recovery, was a really meaningful conversation, because it was accepted at first in many ways that if and when they put in a permanent exit system, that it would resemble, quote, the American standard, which is water flush excreta system interface. But what the opportunity to talk about nutrient sovereignty offered was one that helped them link their relationships to body, to land, to water. So on the next slide, you can see, although the chart is not visible, it just kind of shows a little bit of the coding that was done. When we opened up a conversation, first by one-on-one and then in group discussion, 2 people were interested in like a squatting flush toilet. 6 were interested in a sitting flush. 4 in a squatting compost, and 4 in a sitting compost. So we're able to bust through the stereotype that it's a very sensitive question, right? Because sometimes in refugee populations, other populations of color are considered less than, marginalized. And so folks were a bit worried that if they expressed that actually the freshwater flush system wasn't really what they wanted, that they would be seen as less than, or their produce devalued or questioned. So although a decision has not been made about what type of exit system will be at the farm, the opportunity to talk about it led to the possibility of potentially even having more than one. One to be a demonstration project around composting and nutrient cycling, or at least getting it off of water polluting. And then perhaps with the flush system, maybe one sitting, maybe one squatting. And we focused a lot on the human rights to water and sanitation, and what this project may be, how we may be able to make an intervention in the overall systems of our world that often discard populations and people, and the importance of learning from those who are typically discarded, how we might relate to even our discarded resources. So that's an aspect, I think, of building nutrient sovereignty, is these types of questions and opening up these types of permissions. And the reason that's important that it's collective is because Krisztina and I actually don't want to like necessarily promote a very like libertarian individualist edge to saying it's just me and my nutrients and I'm going to control them. This is about collectivizing our lives together on Earth and thinking within watershed type spaces, what we can do together to build ecological knowledge and to have a just transition where there's an intertwining of the struggle of the people and the struggle of the earth towards regenerative outcomes.
Yeah, so on that note, these are some of the theory bodies that we're working with that we find are informing nutrient sovereignty, and that when working together with all of these theory bodies, there's nutrient sovereignty kind of comes to the surface almost naturally. So for example, excretory justice, Sarah's work on excretory justice is a great example of discard studies. And then my work with Jesse and ASP is an example of collective continuance. And these are the social side of the nutrient sovereignty aspects that are kind of supported by the biogeochemistry in the background, like what the nutrients are actually doing and their interaction with plants. And that's also overlapping with agroecology. But it's really being guided by these social theories.
Yeah, and then like critical environmental justice comes in with an invitation to continue to learn from and center marginalized voices, and to look at many scales of what of how this can work, and to then propel us to think critically about the infrastructure that we've inherited and the injustices potentially built into it and ways of transformation. So we are really interested in talking with this group about, yeah, the theories that also influence your work and how that might relate to nutrient sovereignty at a time when, as Krisztina mentioned earlier, resources are getting increasingly constrained, and how might this shift support regenerative ways of being on the earth, which draw from traditional ecological knowledge, for example.
Yes, and these are it's probably not an exhaustive list of the theories that help inform nutrient sovereignty. And so we hope to discuss these and possibly more that are maybe coming to mind for you, audience members, in the Q&A.
And so we are starting to write a paper, but we are coming to this group first. It was so cool. Like Chris and I met at last year's Rich Earth Institute, right? This summit. And this work is just evidence of what it means when we're here together and having these conversations. And so we've been like chewing on it, so to speak, for some time now. And yeah, y'all the first people, but hopefully, it can support additional work through a paper. So your voices really matter to us. And so far, some of the things that are here present in our brainstorms is that because it's all connected and circular, what nutrient sovereignty can offer is helping to heal the metabolic rift. This is the rift between people and the place in which they eat, excrete, create soil, live, grow, and eat, right? And this rift is when displacement doesn't allow nutrients to cycle. So how might this be healing that? And to also work with some of the other deep concerns we have about ongoing inequities in our society and the ways in which these are exacerbated sometimes by innovation. And so seeking to be really attentive to Indigenous and marginalized perspectives that are calling us to think about the why of what we're doing and how what we're doing either puts us in deeper reciprocal and entangled amazing relationships or tries to extract from those. And so nutrient sovereignty hopefully is a variable in the equation that as we make it more visible, we can see how that plays in, not only at like a broad scale, but also narrow. So we notice that it's got a lot of scales to it, like, really makes an impact on how far nutrients have to travel in a moment of changing climates, or if they, are local. And it also like can help in the orientation of how we are with our bodies as we excrete. And we may have a tendency schooled into us around flushing and forgetting, but what happens when we're present to these what could be offerings if our infrastructure would allow for it, and if we have processes that supported that. And so even on the scale of the individual body, we hope that this idea of nutrient sovereignty is a gift. And in addition to supporting local economies and reducing reliance on international relationships of extraction, the theories of sovereignty, particularly from Indigenous perspectives, can help us think about new ways of being together.
Yeah, and really flipping that narrative that I feel like a lot of us hear all the time, that humans are this negative force on the earth and that we need to leave. There's too many of us. We can only do harm to the environment. When nutrient sovereignty, this concept really offers flipping that narrative and showing that we have these beautiful nutrients from our bodies that we have to offer the environment if we are given a space and an opportunity to manage them with intention.
So in conclusion, just offering this quote here from Sourwine et al. 2023. Approaches to food sovereignty and community health must emanate from the community, be approached holistically, reflect community values and priorities, and center Indigenous land stewardship. And that's how we want to go about writing this, and saying that we're not saying one size fits all. Not everyone needs to use all of their nutrients on their food. No, but we're just helping to try to ask those questions, see what's possible, and do so in a way that's deeply contextual and attentive to legacies, histories, and what that means for shared futures. So your reflections and your questions are welcome as we mature this concept. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. We appreciate you watching the video.
All right. Thank you so much. Wait, give me 1 second. Sarah and Krisztina, you're both here, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So there
Yeah.
are some, thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to this community to continue this conversation. So there are already a couple of ideas that are in the chat from Maureen to look into Jason Moore about Marxism and ecology, and the work of Julia Leno about nutrient flows and imperial history of Europe. And so I think that you already saw that. And there are, I think there's at least one question. Sarah or Krisztina, do you actually want to sort of lead this piece, or do you want me to continue to read from the chat and ask you questions? Just an invitation.
Yeah, whatever works. I think either way works for me.
Not hearing.
We're having a little bit of an audio moment here. We're gonna try to fix. We're switching between computers, so there's a little.
Sarah, will you go ahead and speak one more time?
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
great.
Yeah.
We're all
Thank
good.
you. Fantastic. Like Hilda asked, yeah, what age groups did I approach for my toilet survey, for example? That one, I think, yeah, Jamina, if we like miss a question, that would be so helpful. But like I'll say the age groups that I had a chance to interview were from, they were all above age 18 officially, and went to about, let's say, 65. And at the same time, because I was like with people when they were farming and we were in their homes, one of the like great responses I got was a kid that came in at one point mid interview and just said, "I want a futuristic toilet," and I was like, "What is that? You know, tell me about that excreta infrastructure technology, right?" And they like had something to say about that, and it was really special. And then also the question of accessibility. Like people would say things like, "I used to squat and I loved it, but now my knees, you know, like I need something that works for my body at this age." And so we got to talk a lot about those things as well.
Yeah, that's a big issue to find out about older people or people with handicaps, because the squatting is not going to work anymore. Having to get a hip replacement in a couple of days, I know that one.
I'm seeing a question from Rebecca Nelson, or a hand raised. Rebecca, do you want to go ahead and share your question?
Yes, thank you. Can I be heard? Thank you very much to the speakers. Great to see you, and I hope your adventures are going well where you are. So I want to explore. I really appreciate your putting this proposition to this body. Obviously, this is very real to kind of contemplate and give input to this question. I mean, this theme, and I want to explore something that you raised that made me wonder. This idea of sovereignty in relation to the idea of entrepreneurship that a bunch of people in this group are exploring, myself not directly included, but so, you know, that's my intention would be to figure out ways that people living in informal settlements could make businesses out of the transformation of excreta to fertilizers. And yet I felt like somehow the way you guys were expressing it, that you know, it's really me and my excreta, and that if it were instrumentalized by a business, that would be a violation of the notion of sovereignty. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I feel like we both could probably comment on it, and I'll just start off. I think like our intention, I think Sarah said in the recording, is specifically not to impose this idea that we're a neoliberal idea that these are nutrients from our own bodies, and so they're me and my nutrients, and me as an individual have total control over them, but more so a collective governance in a watershed type of like bioregional governance type of approach with our nutrients. And I see entrepreneurship as very much in that category. I mean, I don't think it's excluded from an idea of managing nutrients in a bioregional context, for example. So you could have one or many small businesses within a bioregion, perhaps working as a collective or a cooperative. And the point being that we're managing our nutrients with intention, as opposed to right now our nutrients are managed as a waste, as we all know, and so they're seen as a negative thing, and funneled to like a centralized location in many cases, and then cause pollution. So I'm hoping I'm answering your question, Rebecca, but I see it very much aligned, like the entrepreneurial aspect aligned with this idea of nutrient sovereignty.
Yeah, thanks. I wasn't clear on how you're navigating that space between, sovereignty as, like don't someone shouldn't profit from it versus the idea of, anyway, yeah, you did address my question.
Super. And I'll just add, within the spaces of informal settlements, there is like sovereignty to the most part, to some extent, has been related to, one second, sorry. Okay, there's a lot of noise around me. But so the folks don't have sovereignty. They're within the context of a nation state that has the sovereignty over them and is dictating all sorts of things, and they don't have like even almost human rights to like they can appeal to. And so the collectivizing that sovereignty discourses have offered us is really significant, particularly coming from indigenous sovereignty languaging and work, and that particularly relates to Turtle Island and Haudenosaunee peoples with whom we studied and kind of thought about this. So really, in many ways, it's kind of like, if it's possible to create spaces where nutrients also are part of the discussion as indigenous folks are working towards collective self-governance in any way, shape, or form, basically doesn't make sense to like just leave out this question of nutrients. So that's like, I think, another info it gets.
Julia has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah and Krisztina. Really inspired by your presentation. I kind of have a sort of question around like how you brought people into starting to talk about toilets, like reclaiming nutrient sovereignty or like human waste sovereignty takes a lot of like investment to create new kinds of toilet systems in terms of like, yeah, there needs to be like a valuing and of that as a service in some way. And then also like the regulatory road to reclaiming that sovereignty is also a big uphill battle. And like it takes a lot of energy and commitment to like commit to rethinking or changing your toilet or nutrient flow system, and how you brought people in your facilitation with these groups, how you brought people into like committing time to even beginning to talk about toilets when there's so many different concerns or things that people have on their plates, and like how you foresee like building energy toward the commitment of that like long road that comes after deciding that you want to change the kind of toilet that you have, if that makes sense.
Again, I thank you, would say that one place where I think this discourse can make an intervention is in people who already care overall about food sovereignty and even nutritious food, but haven't worked on the back end of that food justice. And so there's quite a bit of momentum within those communities. Also, I mean, you could say, too, like, wow, it's a lot when people like realize, oh, I need to change how I eat. And then, wow, how can I do that? And although there's more food choices and it's a discourse that's much more broadly known, there could be some parallels there. I mean, regulatory frameworks and all sorts of stuff come in there. And it was like a really big lift. It was like a really big lift to like really start talking about food sovereignty, even like beyond or in conversation with food justice and things of that nature. And yeah, one intervention is like, hey, this is stopping just short, food justice and food sovereignty, like without that. And what main indigenous response to food sovereignty has been like, food sovereignty is all good, but if we don't have access to the land, that's just a pie in the sky, right? So it's like it's not. So we're looking at, okay, what are the other pieces that actually make indigenous sovereignty possible? How might nutrient sovereignty be possible? And with this, I want to give a shout out to like hopefully this emerging connection between like Nancy Love's lab at Michigan the department I work in with Kyle White and others, Kyle White and them are looking at collective continuance of the Potawatomi and Anishinaabe people. And Nancy is looking at nutrient cycling. And so it's kind of like this merger. So it's like pulling these fields together in a way. So I don't know that nutrient sovereignty gets us all the way there. No, it just gets more people to the Rich Earth Summit, and then in which we could then work together and get more communicators and have more people work with Matthew and them on regulatory. So it's kind of like a movement building mechanism is how I would offer what maybe we're helping to do. Which one could argue, do our academic papers helpful movement building mechanisms? I don't know, but that's why we want to start here before we start writing a paper.
Thank you. Are there hands that I'm missing? There's a question that I'm trying to like create form in my brain, and I might just try to bumble through.
That's what I did.
Bear with me here for a second, unless I'm missing a hand, which maybe gives me a little bit more time to mull over my question.
I've got a shorter question.
Go for it. Thank you.
We've been really curious about learning about indigenous histories of potentially using urine as a fertilizer. And I found like this tiny nugget in Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about when they planted a seed, they put it in a little deerskin pouch with some urine for the urine to give the seed nutrients as it grew. And that's like kind of the only, aside from a few like kind of obscure blog posts, like stories of like indigenous practices of using urine as a fertilizer. And I'm curious if in your research you came across any indigenous histories with that, or if you have ideas on how we might learn more about kind of that history in North America as well as some of these other places you were mentioning in your presentation.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I have done some research, and I do find it's really difficult to find any specific examples. Yeah, I love the Robin Wall Kimmerer example. For the people that I have had the privilege of talking to, they remember in their lifetime using pit latrines, for example, pit toilets, and that wouldn't necessarily mean that that's what they were using for, centuries and millennia before colonization. It's just what they have in their memories. And so that's obviously very different from a flush toilet today. But yeah, in terms of like intentional collective management of nutrients, I've heard of like piles, like basically it sounded like compost piles of excreta as one method. And so everyone kind of just goes to one area and poops in this compost pile. And I'm honestly forgetting which like group of people I was talking to at that point. But yeah, I don't have any other really definitive examples. So it's really hard to find information on that. And so if anyone else does, I'd love to hear them. I know that urine has been used, so this is not necessarily as a nutrient source for agriculture, but it has been used as a dyeing mordant. So like collecting it in a burl of some sort, like a tree burl, and using it as a mordant when dyeing fabrics as a traditional use. But yeah, Sarah, do you have any other examples that are coming to mind? I'm sure I'm just forgetting some as well.
Well, and this is a great reason, like, to spur this on, right? Like that's something I think collectively we can do over time. Like there's a Google Doc, like when people find references, it's important because people who are finding themselves disconnected from their roots for whatever reason are seeking to figure out what does it mean to ally with Indigenous people, or for folks that want to find their own roots that are Indigenous. And that's like really incredible knowledge and importance. The story that always comes to my the story that always comes to my mind is folks from Ladakh in India, and also talking about like, yeah, hey, I mean, we used to like go from our villages and walk to our like biodiverse multi-species jungle like each day, and we could like excrete in peace. And again, the powerful ecosystem that the jungle would like absorb and break down quickly the the nutrients in excreta. And then like, but when the British came to India, like when they chopped down the jungle and like plant rows of pine trees or rows of trees, and we continue with our cultural practices, then all of a sudden the problem of open defecation appears. And so the folks I was talking to were saying, so the solution to open defecation is not more freshwater flush toilets everywhere or other types of excreta infrastructure technology system, it's decolonization. Like that's the way we need our biodiverse jungle environments back again, that we can be a species in community with. So like those stories are really powerful. And then the other pieces, just for the folks that I was connecting with who were refugees, they have a lot of memory of all sorts of other types of extra infrastructure. There were some stories from Lao as well around like stories children would learn about going to find a place to excrete, and that journey being important, but to make sure to not use one particular plant. And unfortunately that plant was like really soft and it was almost like lamb's ear, but if you use it, it would give you a rash, right? So there's like, they have like many stories, like each of my lab participants will share about this, but so there's some like knowledge about what it was like to be excreting outside and finding a good place to do that and things of that nature.
Yeah, there's a question from Nick. Nick, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, great conversation. Thank you. Just curious about if you have any thoughts on parallels with how the COVID pandemic played out sociologically, whether there's a parallel with how human nutrient cycling gets played out. I mean, I'm thinking sort of the food issue as correlated with autoimmune or immune suppression issues, and like the level of vulnerability that certain populations have. And yeah, just curious if you see any parallels there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you for that question. I haven't thought about it exclusively in the past, but what's coming to mind for me right now is, during the pandemic, there are many places around the world, governments decided which services were essential. And it turns out that people that work at wastewater treatment plants and similar are essential workers. And I think managing our excreta potentially became more at the forefront of awareness, just like our food system became more at the forefront of awareness. So it's like people started questioning, oh, well, what would happen if these services weren't available, or people couldn't go to work and manage our excreta, then what do we do with our own nutrients? And maybe they wouldn't even say the word nutrients, but that's what's coming to mind for me right now, is that parallel of how different systems were breaking down and how that changed the consciousness of how our systems function and how vulnerable they are. And that includes managing our excreta. And then, of course, our excreta is now used as a mechanism to quantify the virus load. So then it's become kind of valuable in that way, and centralizing it has allowed for such quantification. So that also comes to mind in terms of relating management to COVID. But yeah, I don't know, Sarah, if you have any thoughts.
That was a really, I think, really, really powerful answer. And the only other piece is like, yes, this is about like vulnerable communities coming together to figure out like, how we'll make it, and also how we, if possible, detach ourselves from intensive hegemonic societies, which are extracting left and right, and so to create ways of being that are alternative, and to let the rest of the movements for social and ecological justice know that, like, hey, paying attention to this little piece over here is not inconsequential as it relates to everything else. And so want to make sure I get to
Jemima's question. If it's more formulated now, but even if it's not, that's okay. And I'll just do that by way of saying, do we have examples of resistance to thinking or talking about handling excreta across cultures? So my sample was farmers. And so farmers, I mean, they were down to earth, y'all. I mean, they already knew about manure. You know, they know that fertilizer is expensive. So for my sample size, I was actually, it's also kind of like trying to like maybe isolate the factor, or like within a group of people who might have proclivity to it, what would be any of the hangups. And in the end, it was just such a hilarious and joyous conversation, as I'm sure you all have experienced when you've eventually broached the topic with people. And once our resistance is tackled through humor or through connection, all of a sudden there's tons of stories. So just one story I'll share is related to the fact that most of the people that I was speaking with had their first interaction with the freshwater flush toilet as part of their orientation to the United States. That this is the I mean, it's very connected. And so all of that, that stuff around assimilation, civilization, standards, all of that was all connected. But at the same time, in that orientation, they also then met that freshwater flush toilet really in person the first time, either in a big city or the airport. And we all know how terrifying airport flush toilets are. They're automatic, they're loud, they're super intense, right? So people are having that as their first jolting experience. And stories are going through the refugee community about like someone who got stuck in an airplane bathroom and he couldn't get out. And so there was a whole group that this person was emigrating with, and nobody was going to the restroom on the plane from their group, which was flying from Nairobi. And no one was going, which means they were also not eating. They were refusing all the food because they did not want to go. They were very nervous. Anyway, at one point, one guy was like, whatever. He was sitting kind of by the toilets and he was studying. He was watching the people come in and come out and come in and come out. He's like, I think I can do this. I think I can do it. So he went in, used the bathroom, came out, and the plane erupted in cheers. And everybody started lining up who was part of that group. It was like, we could do this thing. I mean, so the toilet is there at the nexus of all of this experience. And so that's one way that we got to it, through just thinking about the impact of what it was like to like have to help your babies like poop and pee while you're on the run and being displaced, and then also through these orientation and disorientation processes. And all of my work was translated verbally from Nepali to English. And someone was making a case for the squatting toilet and just saying like, there's no like champlang. And I was like, what is champlang? And champlang is splashback. And it's like an onomatopoeia in Nepali, champlang. So she's like, I don't want splashback. So it was just, we had a good time. So that's how we worked with the resistance of maybe talking about it. And there's more to come when you start to get into aspects of money and different infrastructure. But the community build for us is also part of this general sovereignty work.
Yeah, and I want to hear Jamina's question too, but I just want to quickly add on to that. Amazing stories that you have, Sarah, that are so helpful for contextualizing these concepts. Another like piece to this resistance that I know of is at least one community that I know of in Mexico that treats their excreta as a commons resource. And so seeing excreta as so valuable that you actually, in this community, you have to donate your excreta in order to be a part of the community. And so that's part of the soil building process. And it's not commodified in that it can't be exchanged for money. And it has to be collectively managed as a commons resource. And so I see that as like an example of resistance against the current capitalistic and hegemonic societies that are dominating today.
Great. Thank you. My question is, it feels a little bit off topic potentially, or a little bit away from where we are in this moment of the conversation. I will pose it and I'm not sure, but I guess my question is sort of around like helping me rethink the like safety concerns that I feel like we've been so trained around in in how we manage our waste. I exist in the space of like pee and poo is really, really powerful. Poo has so much potential for creativity or for creation and for being a fertilizer, and also like needs to be handled with caution and with care and with safety precautions and whatnot. And so the way that I know I've been like trained to think about that is around some sort of regulation or some sort of oversight or some sort of, you know, that kind of mentality, which I recognize this is pushing against that. And I guess like help me make that jump from, okay, if there is more sovereignty and there's more individualism in this, or there's more like decentralization and community, which I'm super on board for, sort of how do those marry? And the other thing that I think a lot about is that the concept of using our waste as a resource, as we have said in many ways, is not a new concept. I think how we do it in the existing world that we're in, with the number of people that we're in, with the infrastructure that's already embedded, with the regulations, with the politics, with the finances, with like all those, with the pharmaceuticals, with the PFAS, with all those things, that's the new problem. And so I think I often have a hard time sort of building that bridge between what was possible with what our world is now, and how do we do that in a way that is actually inclusive and safe and effective and all those things. That's my struggle in this conversation.
Go ahead, Krisztina, then I'll.
Okay, yeah, it's such a valid question, of course, and something that is in the back of my mind always when talking about excreta. And I think that we touched on this idea of like, well, we can't be nutrient sovereign if we don't have access to land. And I think that that is, for me, a really central piece to this puzzle. And so the access to land means like obviously a huge paradigm shift in how we manage everything, including our excreta. And I think that would allow for, certainly there would be a need for education across the board, like how do we manage our excreta safely? But I think it would also allow for more autonomy for communities to govern their own excreta, as well as other land-based aspects of life that don't involve this top-down regulatory body telling people what they can or cannot do without understanding the consequences of those regulations, and instead having communities govern themselves, knowing that they are going to experience the consequences of their own decisions. And so whether that mean like health risks or not would depend on education and motivation of that community. And then again, it would depend on the whole watershed, since of course, even if you're in one area as a community, you're going to affect everyone downstream of you. So right now, I don't like, even though we do have regulations that I think are important for managing health and safety, at the same time, they're so far, like the people that are making those decisions are so far removed from what's actually happening on the ground, that I would love to see, maybe not in my lifetime, but I'm going to work my darndest to see that like middle ground of like more autonomy at the bioregional scale, rather than like, a group of a few handful of people managing like a massive landscape and not understanding the consequences of what they're doing. I hope that answers your question a little bit, but I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I appreciate
And we're
that.
gonna wrap soon, but the
Yeah,
work
sorry.
that we're doing on regulation, it would add to the nutrient sovereignty. I don't see our work in any way coming against it. In fact, it is the work of, especially when we're doing it with a justice framework in mind, that is thinking of the most vulnerable and seeking to connect with them and learn together. This is the type of regulation we want to create. The question of sovereignty is not usually about whether or not there's regulation, it's who gets to make those regulations. Collective governance is absolutely crucial. Clear and understandable
management, and I would even call it sacred process work with our gifts to the earth, is something that we ought to pour as much energy into, like a priesthood, than we would pour into like a church priesthood. I mean, like, we need people who are absolutely dedicated to this, but to see it as really important. Just to use like an example. Sorry, I've been sitting in Jerusalem, so there's just like the air is very cloudy with prayers here. So we're just like thinking about where we put our energies. And the invitation is towards this earthly body and sense, and we want to make sure to say, like, this is actually not a libertarian or eco-fascist project which says my nutrients are mine, but it actually just says, how am I in this flow with others as part of this living body of earth, and what is the work that is ours to do, as Krisztina said, at that watershed scale, or whatever scales we are able to practice these new regulatory frameworks that help us all come into deeper alignment.
Amazing. Thank you so much.